Hi there, Matt Easton. So, bayonets. Are bayonets similar to spears? On the surface of it, it seems like a musket or rifle with the bayonet attached is fundamentally similar to a spear. It's essentially a polearm and it has a spike on the end. So you'd be like, oh yeah, I know how to use a spear, therefore I know how to use the bayonet. And this is kind of true and kind of not. There are some really big differences, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. There's some really big differences between the bayonet on the end of a musket and a spear. The first one we shall look at is, picking up the spear gingerly and carefully. Yeah, that's right, you can't see the end of it because it's hugely longer. Okay, so one of the big differences between a bayonet and a spear is a huge amount of length. Now, I know some of you will say, oh, but Matt, there are shorter spears. And yeah, that's absolutely true. So you can see I'm 6'1", and this bayonet comes up to maybe the top of my head, but it's about 6 foot long. This is, by the way, is an 1853 Enfield musket, an original antique with an original bayonet on it. And it's essentially the height of a person, of a tall person, especially in the period. So I just gingerly put down this spear again because it is full length. The spear is about 8 foot long, I think. So, and the spearhead, incidentally, which I'll just show you, here it comes. The spearhead is made by Paul Binns, and it's sharp and it's very, very nice and made. It's a kind of Anglo-Saxon design and very nicely forged. So fundamentally they are similar in that they're both pole weapons and they both really are stabbers. They can't really cut. You could conceivably maybe push cut or draw cut with the spear. You can't at all with this bayonet because it's triangular. Obviously if it was a sword bayonet you could maybe cut with it slightly like a glaive, but they don't cut very well at all. They're primarily stabbing weapons. So in that sense, bayonets and spears are similar in that they're both pole weapons and they're both stabby pole weapons, and they both got a point principally at one end, not usually at the other end. However, that's pretty much where the similarity stops. The first big differences we've seen is length. Okay, the fact that this is only 6 foot and spears can be 8 foot, obviously pikes can be up to 12 or even 16 foot, but usually spears are taller than a person. That being said, if we look at Fiore or Vardi, for example, they're clearly using shorter spears, and the shorter spears, certainly in Europe, seem to have been, in the Middle Ages anyway, principally for fighting in armour. Because if you're fighting in armour, the fight comes close, you don't want a particularly long, unwieldy spear. Equally, on the flip side, the armour enables you to get closer to the opponent without very much risk at all. So a poleaxe length, in other words, for fighting in armour, polearms like poleaxes and spears and whatever else tend to be about man height, because that's what works best. But if you're unarmoured, so we're talking about most other periods outside of the sort of late Middle Ages, then usually spears are longer than a person. However, I do understand that's not the case. So we'll ignore the length thing for now, except just to say that usually spears are longer than bayonets on the end of rifles. And also I should mention that generally speaking, this is about as long as a bayonet on a rifle or musket ever gets. In later periods, for example, when the bolt-action rifles came along and things like that, even with the Martini Henry, they tend to get a bit shorter. So the next thing is, due to that length, the lead hand is closer to the opponent's weapon, particularly if they're using swords. Okay, so if your opponent's using a sword, you don't have very much risk of being hit in the lead hand with the spear because it's so long. However, the biggest risk of using the bayonet against a person with a sword is that they can reach your lead hand, because the length between the point of the bayonet and your hand is about the same length as a sword blade. So that's always a risk. Okay. The next difference is a little bit more subtle and maybe something that people don't think of that much. So one of the advantages to a spear, and again this is 8 foot long, so I'm having to maneuver this gingerly, is because it has a plain and smooth shaft, you're able to shift where your hands are on this really, really easily. And that has all sorts of advantages. Number one, it means that I can deliver a thrust by just driving with my back hand, which is incredibly quick, and I can leave my lead hand in the same position. Equally, if someone knocks my point offline and closes in with me, I'm able to bring my backhand around and actually hit with the back end of the weapon much more easily. So essentially, having two hands which can slide up and down the shaft, so to speak, makes the weapon more versatile. Okay, with the with the bayonet, I can do that a bit, okay, but not very much. And the reason is because of all of the obstructions essentially on the firearm. Where we can grip at the back of the weapon varies between anywhere around where you'd normally grip it to shoot, so near the trigger guard, all the way back to even holding the butt. And some sources really love holding the butt. So if we look at Anthony Gordon, for example, he loved the butt. Most later sources hold it up near the narrow part of the grip where you'd normally shoot, essentially. So that can move a little bit, but it's not very versatile, it has to be said. The advantage, incidentally, this is a more secure grip, this holding it at the butt gives you a little bit of extra reach. That's the main differences. The lead hand can move a bit, but because of the bands holding the barrel on and other obstructions you have on different models of firearm, it does mean it's not very easy to do that. Okay. However, coming to the what I'll list as the final, there are other differences, but the other final and biggest difference in hand-to-hand combat, obviously the firearm can shoot and the spear can't, but the final and biggest difference is weight. Okay, now, spears can be super light. Obviously, the thicker you make the shaft and the bigger you make the head, the heavier the weapon gets. Some people neglect to note that about a difference between, for example, a partisan and a spear, is that whilst a partisan can cut, and they think, oh, that's great, so it can cut, why not just forget about spears and just have a partisan? But partisans are heavier. The more metal you put on the end of the weapon, and remember all the weight is concentrated at the end of the weapon, the more you put on there, the slower the weapon gets. And one of the great advantages of a spear is speed. If you make the weapon heavier, then it's not so fast. Another issue is languettes, okay? So people will point out the vulnerability of wooden shafts against bladed weapons, which is true. It's not that easy to cut through them, but you can damage them and eventually break them in a protracted combat. If you put languettes, that is iron or steel splints essentially down the side, then it prevents or it makes them more resistant to those enemy edged weapon attacks and potentially breaking just through impact as well. However, it makes them a lot heavier again, so it makes them slower. So with the spear, one of the great advantages of it is the speed with which it can stab and stab again, okay, and move around, move from high to low, left to right, change its targets. It's a bit like the kind of the small sword of the polearm world, and it's really, really nimble. The bayonet is absolutely not, okay? Thanks to the massive firearm that the bayonet's connected to, this weighs around 9 pounds. That is right. It's heavier in pretty much all ways. A bayonet on a musket is heavier than a Zweihander. That is right. So some of you may think that these things are immensely heavy, but actually they are lighter than these. And not only that, but the sword, the Zweihander or two-handed sword, is, you could say, better balanced because it's balanced back towards the person's hands, and it's the weight is distributed, perhaps you could say, a little bit more evenly through the thing, and it's sort of lighter at the tip. With the musket and bayonet, the weight's basically slap bang in the middle. Okay, so the weight's distributed evenly, obviously, through it because you've got a lot of the weights in the gun barrel itself. But nevertheless, it is a heavy object. So, to finish up, whilst length can be a big difference, and the ability to move the hands on the weapon can be a big difference between bayonets and spears, really, the really massive, massive difference between a bayonet and a spear is that the bayonet is nowhere near as nimble. Now, you may say, why is that important? If everyone's running around the battlefield with similar weapons, it's not a problem. If everybody has spears, then there's no speed difference between them. If everybody has bayonets, there's no speed difference between them. Where it comes into play is in the question, for example, of sword versus spear or sword versus bayonet. And a lot of people have a go at sword versus spear and find it hugely difficult because spears tend to overwhelm swords due to the speed and distance at which they can attack and repeatedly attack. The bayonet has some of those advantages due to length, and due to weight a little bit. It can outbind the sword, and leverage. It has the length advantage over the sword, but because it's so much heavier, it's much slower in its attacks, and it's much slower in its defences. It doesn't have the reach advantage that spears normally have, and it can't slide the weapon forward in the way that spears can. In fact, one thing that the bayonet does do occasionally is lance one-handed, which I'll tell you requires some degree of strength to do. And the secret is basically to push forward and pull back. Don't try and do any lateral movement whatsoever. So it can get around that lancing effect, that sliding effect that the spear uses. It can do a similar thing. But when we're talking about sword versus spear or sword versus bayonet, the weight of the musket or rifle really goes against it. And so the match between sword and bayonet is much closer than the match between sword and spear. Spears and bayonets are not that similar. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.